Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Man with the Poison Gun, a Cold War spy story, by Serhii Plokhy, narrated by Clive Chafer. Preface. In the fall of 1961, as American and Soviet tanks faced one another at Checkpoint Charlie in the newly divided city of Berlin, and David Cornwell, a British spy more commonly known as John le Carré, was contemplating the writing of his first best-selling novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, the West German police were interrogating a Soviet spy. The slim 30-year-old man had papers in the name of an East German, Josef Lehmann, but claimed that his real name was Bogdan Stashinsky and that he was a citizen of the Soviet Union. Stashinsky admitted during questioning that he was single-handedly responsible for tracking down and killing 2 Ukrainian émigrés hiding in Munich, where they had been conspiring to liberate their country and destroy the Soviet Union. He had used a new, specially designed secret weapon, a spray pistol delivering liquid poison that, if fired into the victim's face, killed without leaving a trace. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who had spent a good part of his career in Ukraine, had regarded the émigré leaders as personal enemies. They had been the primary targets of multiple KGB assassination attempts and ultimately victims of Stashinsky's poison gun. Stashinsky's testimony implicating the Kremlin rulers in political assassinations carried out abroad was a bombshell, shaking the worlds of espionage and international politics. The Stashinsky case changed how the Soviets fought the Cold War, forcing the KGB to abandon its practice of foreign assassination. It also ended the career of the KGB chief Aleksandr Shelepin, who had aspired to replace Nikita Khrushchev and then Leonid Brezhnev at the top of the Soviet power pyramid. In West Germany, the Stashinsky trial changed how Nazi criminals were prosecuted. Using the Stashinsky case as a precedent, many defendants in such cases claimed, as had the Soviet spy, that they were simply accessories to murder, while their superiors who ordered the killings were the main perpetrators. West German legislators eventually changed the law to make it impossible for Nazi perpetrators to claim the Stashinsky defense. In the United States, Stashinsky's case was investigated by a subcommittee of the U.S. Senate, and the evidence he provided was considered in the conclusions of the Warren Commission on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Many conspiracy theorists still believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was trained by the KGB in the same facility as Bogdan Stashinsky. Stashinsky's story captured the imagination of the Western world. It was featured in a long article in Life magazine and made it into successive editions of Great True Spy Stories compiled by former CIA chief Allen Dulles. In Ian Fleming's last James Bond novel, The Man with the Golden Gun, Bond, brainwashed by the Soviets, tries to assassinate his boss by shooting him with a cyanide-loaded poison gun. The Stashinsky story served as the basis of a number of radio and television features around the world. It inspired numerous books and documentary films, at least 2 novels, 2 theatre plays, and 1 movie. For decades, the KGB denied any involvement in the Stashinsky assassinations, and for decades, CIA officers could never be entirely sure whether Stashinsky's story was true or false. Even today, some authors claim that Stashinsky was in fact a loyal KGB agent who had been sent to the West in order to bear false witness and thereby shield the prized KGB agent who actually did the job. By tapping into new, previously unavailable sources, this book finally puts to rest many earlier theories and speculations about Stashinsky's assassinations. It also places the Stashinsky story into the broad context of the Cold War, the relentless battle of ideologies and cultures between East and West, and demonstrates the crushing impact that the Soviet police state had on the population living east of the Iron Curtain. Most of what we know today about Bogdan Stashinsky, his crime and his punishment, comes from the testimony that he gave at his trial in Karlsruhe, Germany, in October 1962. We can now supplement that data with information from recently declassified files of the Central Intelligence Agency, KGB and Polish security archives, and memoirs and interviews of former KGB officers. The study of graveyard records in a Berlin suburb made it possible to corroborate parts of the story originally told by Stashinsky, and my interview with a former head of the South African police allowed me to trace the former Soviet assassin to that country. He is probably still living there, always looking over his shoulder, aware that the old habits of the KGB die hard, if at all. Prologue. On the sunny morning of October 15th, 1959, a tram coming from downtown Munich made its regular stop on the Ludwig Bridge across the Isar River. "Deutsches Museum," announced the conductor. The German Museum of Masterpieces of Science and Technology, which had housed the world's largest collection of scientific exhibits before the war, was a few hundred yards away, its main building located on an island in the middle of the river. While the museum still showed signs of damage suffered during the Allied bombing of the city, the passengers could also see signs of post-war revival. The museum building was being restored, and new houses had been built on the bombed-out Zeppelinstrasse on the right bank of the river. The doors of the tramcar opened, allowing passengers to enter and exit. A slim, flat-chested man with sloping shoulders in his late 20s waited on the Ludwig Bridge, but showed no interest in hopping onto the tram. He also missed a tram going in the opposite direction, toward Karlsplatz and the Hauptbahnhof, the main railway station. Nor was he on his way to the museum. He stood on the bridge, looking toward the river and Zeppelinstrasse. After a moment he left the bridge, walking along Zeppelinstrasse toward building number 67, near which a dark blue Opel Capitan was parked. The man came close enough to read the sedan's license plate. He then returned to his post on the bridge, where he kept an eye on the car and the building nearby. Finally, around noon, activity caught his attention. A man in his early 50s left the building with a younger woman and got into the car. The Opel Capitan pulled away from the curb and proceeded along Zeppelinstrasse, away from the Ludwig Bridge. The young man watched the car until it disappeared from sight. Then he boarded the downtown tram. At noon, the young man from the Ludwig Bridge was on the other side of the city, getting off the tram on the Maß-Mann-Platz. From there he walked toward the Kreit-Meyer-Strasse, and then in the direction of St. Benno's Catholic Church at the end of the street. He paused at the recently constructed apartment building at number 7 and looked into its archway, which led to the courtyard and garages, but the dark blue Opel Capitan was nowhere in sight. He walked along the street once again, repeatedly checking his watch. Finally he spotted the Opel Capitan approaching in his direction. He could see the license plate. It was the same car, but the driver was alone. When the Opel Capitan turned into the archway at number 7, the young man headed for the main entrance and opened the door with a key. He locked the door from the inside and took the stairs to the ground floor, deciding to wait there until the owner of the Opel Capitan entered the hallway. Suddenly he heard voices upstairs. "Wiedersehen, until we meet again," said a female voice, and someone began to descend the stairs. The young man panicked. He was caught on the stairs between this unknown resident and the owner of the Opel Capitan, who could appear at any moment. Finally he decided to return to the ground floor, turned his face toward the elevator door, and pressed the elevator button. A few seconds later he heard steps behind him. It was a woman, as he could tell from the click of her high heels. She opened the door and left the building. Relieved, the young man returned to his previous position behind the first turn of the stairs, out of sight of anyone entering. A few moments later he looked out and saw the man he was waiting for, the owner of the Opel Kapitan from Zeppelinstrasse. The man was short, stocky, and balding. He was struggling to remove his key from the main door. He carried some bags under his arm. One of them was open, and the young man could see that it contained tomatoes. The young man bent down and pantomimed tying his shoelace. He knew that the gesture looked unnatural, but he wanted to avoid approaching the man with the tomatoes while the entrance door was still open. The young man straightened up and resumed his movement toward the door. "Funktioniert es nicht? Isn't it working?" he heard himself say. "Doch, es funktioniert. Now it's working," responded the owner of the Opel Kapitan. The young man grasped the outside doorknob with his left hand. His right hand, in which he held a rolled-up newspaper, came up, with one end pointed toward the man's face. There was a soft pop. He saw the older man's body moving backward and to the side. He did not see it fall. He stepped outside and closed the entrance door behind him. On the street he unrolled the newspaper and removed the 8-inch cylinder which had been concealed within. The gun went into his pocket. The mission was over. Stashinsky had finally done it. Part 1. KGB Man. 1. Stalin's Call. Nikita Khrushchev, the balding, overweight, but surprisingly energetic future leader of the Soviet Union, was in the middle of a speech when a note was delivered to the podium asking him to call Moscow as soon as possible. It was December 1st, 1949, and Khrushchev, then a party boss of Ukraine, was addressing professors and students in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv. The city and its environs had belonged to Poland before World War II, but were annexed to the Soviet Union in 1939 as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. After the short-lived Soviet-German alliance was dissolved, the Soviets lost the region to invading Germans in June 1941, but reclaimed it in July 1944. Ever since, they had unsuccessfully tried to convince the local Ukrainian population to accept life under Soviet rule. It was a difficult proposition. The Ukrainians wanted their own state. A few weeks before Khrushchev's speech, Ukrainian nationalist guerrillas had scored a major victory by assassinating Yaroslav Halan, a communist author and one of the main propagandists of the new regime. Khrushchev came to Lviv to personally oversee the investigation and lead the hunt for Halan's killers. One of them had turned out to be a student, and Khrushchev was now addressing local college administrators and party activists among the students to alert them to the dangers of nationalism. The request to call Moscow caught Khrushchev by surprise. He finished his speech, calling on the students to fight nationalism in their ranks and stand on guard against the guerrillas, left the meeting and placed a call to the Kremlin. On the other end of the line was Stalin's right-hand man, Georgy Malenkov, the party boss responsible for the appointment and dismissal of Soviet officials. Khrushchev had been called back to the Kremlin. "How urgent is it?" asked Khrushchev. "Very. Get a plane first thing tomorrow morning," came the answer. "I left ready for anything, trying to anticipate all sorts of unpleasant surprises," recalled Khrushchev later. 3 years earlier, in 1946, Stalin had removed Khrushchev as first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine, assigning him to the less important office of head of the Ukrainian cabinet. The appointment was punishment for Khrushchev's demands that Moscow help relieve the Ukrainian famine of 1946 to 1947. Stalin, whose insistence on high grain procurement quotas had caused the famine, refused to listen or to help. Annoyed with Khrushchev's demands, he replaced him with Lazar Kaganovich, one of the organizers of the Great Famine of 1932 to 1933, which had claimed the lives of as many as 4 million Ukrainians. Chastised, Khrushchev fell into line and showed no mercy in extracting grain from the exhausted Ukrainian peasantry. Close to 1 million people died as a result. In the fall of 1947, Stalin reinstalled Khrushchev in his former post of party boss of Ukraine. But what did Stalin want now? Was the summons to Moscow related to the assassination of Yaroslav Halan and Khrushchev's perceived inability to end the Ukrainian resistance? The guerrilla fighters were universally known as Banderites, a name derived from that of the leader of the revolutionary, most militant branch of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, Stepan Bandera. Judging by Khrushchev's memoirs, he had first heard of Bandera in 1939. That year, as head of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Khrushchev oversaw the incorporation of Western Ukraine into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Bandera, who was serving a life sentence for his role in the 1934 assassination of the Polish Minister of the Interior, had walked out of the prison in 1939 following the German invasion of Poland, slipping through Soviet hands. We were impressed by Bandera's record as an opponent of the Polish government, but we should have taken into account the fact that men like him were also enemies of the Soviet Union, remembered Khrushchev later. As Stalin shared the spoils of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler, taking control of first Western Ukraine and Belarus, and then the Baltic states and the Romanian provinces of Moldavia and Bukovina, Bandera led a revolt against the old leadership of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and offered the services of his faction of the OUN to Germany. The German-Soviet alliance turned out to be short-lived. On June 22, 1941, the German armies crossed the Soviet border and began their movement eastward, pushing the retreating Red Army out of western Ukraine. On June 30, 1941, a week after Germany's attack on its former ally, Bandera and his people declared the creation of an independent Ukrainian state. But an independent Ukraine had no place in German plans. They wanted Lebensraum, living space, a territory cleansed of the local population and made ready for German settlement. The Gestapo arrested Bandera and his associates, demanding that they rescind their declaration. Bandera refused and spent most of the war in the German concentration camp of Sachsenhausen. 2 of his brothers died in Auschwitz. It's true that when Bandera realized that the Hitlerites did not intend to keep their promise to sponsor an independent Ukraine, he turned his units against them, recalled Khrushchev. But even then, he did not stop hating the Soviet Union. During the second half of the war, he fought both against us and the Germans. By 1944, the Ukrainian nationalists had organized a guerrilla force numbering as many as 100,000 men. Formally, they constituted the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Informally, they were known as Banderites. As we pushed the Germans west, we encountered an old enemy, Ukrainian nationalists, recalled Khrushchev. The Banderites were setting up partisan detachments of their own. After his release from Sachsenhausen, Bandera fled to Austria. The insurgency was run by others who had little, if any, contact with their faraway leader, but Bandera's name remained closely linked with the underground. All aspects of guerrilla warfare, good and bad, became associated with Bandera. The self-sacrifice of young men and women who gave their lives for the cause of Ukrainian independence, as well as the ethnic cleansing of Poles in western Ukraine, the participation of the individual members of the nationalist underground in the Holocaust, and the gruesome assassinations of Soviet collaborators such as Yaroslav Halan. The Soviets employed tens of thousands of regular troops, thousands of members of special detachments, and locally formed militias to fight the nationalist underground. They reported killing more than 100,000 bandits and arresting another 250,000 in 1944 to 1946. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were deported from western Ukraine to Siberia and Kazakhstan. The commanders of the Ukrainian insurgent army, which now numbered fewer than 5,000 soldiers, switched to small-scale attacks on Soviet government institutions and military installations. Individual terror against representatives of Soviet rule and local collaborators became the new modus operandi. The insurgents understood that they could not win in a pitched battle. Their only remaining hope for personal survival and the creation of an independent Ukrainian state was a new global war, this time between the United States and the Soviet Union. Slowly but relentlessly, Soviet counterinsurgency operations and terror against the local population delivered results. By 1948, Ukrainian nationalist resistance had weakened sufficiently to allow the Soviets to begin the mass collectivization of agriculture, the centerpiece of their program of socialist transformation. Soviet agents penetrated many of the remaining insurgent units and tried to gain control over communications between local insurgents and Bandera's émigré followers who were headquartered in Munich, the center of the American occupation zone in Germany. Still, the Soviet secret police could not reach the leadership of the insurgent army or prevent assassinations of regime supporters like Yaroslav Halan. Nikita Khrushchev had known Halan personally. In 1946, Halan had represented the Soviet Ukrainian media at the Nuremberg trials of major war criminals, where he had demanded the extradition of Stepan Bandera from the American occupation zone of Germany. Back home he attacked the Ukrainian nationalists with his fiery pamphlets. Halan also targeted the Ukrainian Catholic Church. Its hierarchs were arrested and its priests forced to accept the jurisdiction of the Russian Orthodox Church as part of the Soviet struggle against the Vatican and its political, religious, and cultural influences in the Soviet-controlled part of Europe. The Church's faithful were driven underground. Halan's vitriolic attacks on the Church did not go unnoticed in Rome, and in July 1949 Pope Pius XII excommunicated him. Halan responded with a new pamphlet in which he wrote, "I spit on the Pope." Many believed that the phrase sealed Halan's fate in the eyes of the insurgents who allied themselves with the persecuted Ukrainian Catholic Church. Khrushchev was immediately informed of Halan's death and called Moscow to let Stalin know what had happened in Lviv. The aging and ever more paranoid Soviet dictator was not pleased. The assassination left no doubt that more than 5 years after the Red Army had recaptured western Ukraine from the retreating Germans, and more than 4 years after the Red Banner had been flown atop the Reichstag building in central Berlin, the Ukrainian underground was still fighting the victorious Soviet superpower. And not somewhere on the periphery of the communist world, but in its very heart within the borders of the USSR. Stalin dispatched his best secret police forces to Ukraine. They were told that Comrade Stalin has rated the work of the security organs combating banditry in western Ukraine as highly unsatisfactory. They were ordered to find the assassins and crush the remaining Ukrainian resistance. Khrushchev knew that his job was on the line. That is why he not only came to Lviv in person to oversee the investigation, but also brought along a full team to help increase police and party control over locals. The Minister of the Interior, the secretaries of the Central Committee of the Ukrainian Communist Party, and even the first secretary of the Ukrainian branch of the Komsomol, the Young Communist League. Khrushchev wanted his underlings to turn Lviv and western Ukraine into a fortress. According to one account, he was prepared to introduce drastic measures to remove the recruitment base for the underground. He would round up young men and send them to the Donbass mines or to trade schools in eastern Ukraine, or even perhaps place the population under strict control through a system of internal passports, a step that would have turned the whole region into a huge prison camp outside of Soviet laws. Khrushchev dropped that idea only after Stalin's security experts protested his plans. One of them believed that Khrushchev's proposed measures would drive Ukrainian youth into the forests, directly into the hands of the insurgents. Upon receiving a call from the Kremlin, Khrushchev put his plans on hold and flew to Moscow as ordered. "I did not know what my status would be when I returned to Ukraine, or even if I would return at all," he remembered later. The trip turned out to be the most fateful of his career. Instead of being reprimanded or arrested, Khrushchev was promoted. The aging dictator wanted Khrushchev by his side in Moscow, and he gave him control of the city's party organization to fight internal enemies. Stalin was purging party cadres of real and alleged supporters of the Leningrad group of Soviet officials, who were accused of attempting to form a separate Russian Communist Party, a potential threat to the unity of the All-Union Communist Party led by Stalin. Khrushchev, the long-time leader of Ukraine, seemed a natural ally in the struggle against Russian particularism, which threatened to topple the empire. Khrushchev was more than relieved. He thanked Stalin for his trust in him. "I've been treated well, and I am thankful to everyone who has helped with the supervision of Ukraine," he told the dictator. "But I will nonetheless be glad to get back to Moscow." Stalin wanted him to go back to Ukraine, wrap up unfinished business there, and return to the Soviet capital in time for the lavish celebration of his 70th birthday, scheduled for December 21st, 1949. On that day, Stalin seated Khrushchev next to himself. On Stalin's other side was the leader of Communist China, Mao Zedong. Khrushchev had begun his ascent to the summit of Soviet power, but he would never forget the scare caused by Stalin's unexpected summons, and the person he believed responsible for Ukrainian resistance to the Soviets, Stepan Bandera. 2. Master Killer. As Khrushchev took part in the celebrations for Stalin's birthday in Moscow, his former subordinates in Ukraine continued their hunt for the leaders of the Ukrainian underground. Many of them celebrated New Year's Day 1950 in Lviv instead of returning to Kiev or Moscow, and spent months after that in western Ukraine. Among them was General Pavel Sudoplatov, the most senior security official to be sent from Moscow to Lviv with the task of destroying the leadership of the armed resistance. Sudoplatov followed his orders. Killing leaders of the Ukrainian movement was in fact his specialty. Sudoplatov had been given his first assignment in that line of work in November 1937, when he was a 30-year-old foreign intelligence officer. He was first summoned to the office of Stalin's People's Commissar, Minister of the Interior, Nikolai Yezhov, and then taken to meet Stalin himself. At the time, Sudoplatov, a native of Ukraine and a fluent Ukrainian speaker, had infiltrated Ukrainian émigré circles in Europe by posing as a representative of the Ukrainian underground based in the Soviet Union. Stalin, eager for a status report on relations among the leaders of the various Ukrainian organizations, had summoned Sudoplatov to his office. Sudoplatov revealed that they were all competing with one another for positions in the future government of independent Ukraine, but the most dangerous of all was Yevhen Konovalets, the head of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Konovalets was then the superior of Stepan Bandera, and the OUN had the backing of German military intelligence, the Abwehr. "What are your suggestions?" asked Stalin. Sudoplatov had none. Stalin gave him a week to prepare a plan for combating Konovalets and his organization. A week later, Sudoplatov came back to Stalin's office with a plan for penetrating the Abwehr by means of Soviet agents in Konovalets' organization. This plan was clearly not what Stalin had in mind. Stalin gave the floor to Hrihori Petrovsky, an old Bolshevik and one of the leaders of Soviet Ukraine who had been invited to sit in on the meeting. As Sudoplatov later recalled,
"Sample complete. Ready to continue?"